Hey viewers, my name is Cara. This video is going to be the next installment in my series of going over discussion questions or journaling prompts for The Spiral Dance by Starhawk. This video is covering chapters 4 through 6. The previous video covering the introductions and chapters 1 through 3 was posted on my channel toward the end of August earlier this year, 2020. I will link to that if you haven't seen that yet. This video series is intended for people mostly to use if you are going through and reading this book yourself. This is the 20th anniversary edition. I do recommend the updated editions if you can get your hands on them because they have additional notes from 10 years later and 20 years later after the book was originally published, which was 1979. So there are notes from 89 and 99. Unfortunately, we don't have any notes or new editions since then, but I do recommend the 20th anniversary edition if you can get it because there are a lot of changes, especially with some of the things talked about in chapters 4 through 6 that I'm going to be talking about in this video. There are notes toward the back of the book that say, in the past 10 years since this book was published, we have now changed some of our views on these things. And then 10 years after that, things have changed further. And now we are 20 more years beyond that point, and things have continued to change and evolve in the tradition and in the reclaiming community. For anyone who doesn't know, this book was written by Starhawk. It was originally published in 79, as I mentioned, and at that time, the practices talked about here were not considered their own tradition quite yet, but over the decades after this book came out, reclaiming came to be known as its own tradition of witchcraft. So this is considered a foundational text of the reclaiming tradition, even though when the original text was published, it wasn't really thought of in that way. So there are a lot of things here that you might notice that seem pretty common to other neo-pagan paths out there. There was a lot of shared material. Some of what it gets into in chapters 4 through 6 is stuff that comes to reclaiming from a tradition called Anderson Fairy, which is now spelled F-E-R-I. At the time of first publication, it was being spelled F-A-E-R-Y. Later on, it became known by a different name to kind of differentiate it from the others that were occurring. So there's all kinds of updates like that. In my Patreon community and in my developing home reclaiming community here in the state of Ohio, some of us have been reading The Spiral Dance together this year. So those of us who started at the same time, we started with reading the introductions and chapter 1 and 2 in May of 2020. In June, we read and discussed chapter 3. And so that video is already on the channel, as I mentioned. Then in July, we read chapter 4 just by itself. There are exercises in the book as well, so I broke it up so that we had approximately the same number of pages and exercises to look at each month. So in July, we did just chapter 4, and then in August, we read and discussed chapters 5 and 6, which, as you'll notice as I get into them, they kind of go together. So we put those together in 1 month. So again, I somewhat think of this series as useful for people who are reading through this book themselves. That's kind of the main idea behind this. If you are reading this book on your own, you want to hear some of the other things that we have been discussing in my Patreon community and some of my personal thoughts and discussion questions, things to think about, muse about, stuff like that. That's what this series is. But there are also some questions that I might quote something that I've written down here in my personal notebook. This is my dedicated Spiral Dance notebook. There might be some general concepts and questions that hopefully people can still think about and muse about and come to their own conclusions, even if you're not reading the book. So hopefully there are still some things that you can get out of this series if you're not reading the book. However, please just bear in mind that's not the main way that I expect people to be using this series, so I am not going through every single thing that's in the chapters. But there are some things that I might quote or give you a little bit of context on because I feel like that really is necessary for the discussion question or journal prompt or whatever we want to call them. So let's start with chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Creating Sacred Space. So it opens up with talking about circle casting and how we might do that. It points out that the ability to cast the circle is not dependent on gender, so it doesn't have to be a female covener, it doesn't have to be a male covener. Anyone who's qualified, by which I believe this means anyone who knows how to do it, can do it. It's not gender dependent. I don't know, maybe at the time of first publication, that is something that seemed like it needed to be pointed out. Maybe there were some traditions that said only women can cast the circle or only men can cast the circle or something like that. In my experience in reclaiming communities and at witch camps and in workshops and stuff like that, we actually typically cast circle with everyone. It's not led by any one person or two people. It's typically a communal effort where we all contribute to the circle casting in more or less equal ways. Starhawk discusses in this chapter that the circle in witchcraft is, quote, not so much to keep out negative energies as to keep in power so that it can rise to a peak. And that is on page 83 of the 20th anniversary edition. This is something that I feel like is often misunderstood, so I thought I would point this one out. I know that a lot of people who watch my channel, and therefore who might be watching these videos, are fairly experienced practitioners. You've already been casting circles for a while, so you already know why you personally do it or how you personally like to do it. But I'm trying to also keep in mind that there are going to be people reading this book and who might find these videos in the future that this is really their introduction to these types of things. So I want to point out that in my experience over the past couple of decades, this has been a question that a lot of people have had, is like not understanding why some of us might cast circle or the different reasons that there are for it. Other traditions, other paths, other practices, there might be other reasons for casting a circle, such as protecting yourself from a negative influence that you might be inviting into your space for whatever reason, to ask it questions, get answers, strike a deal, whatever. That's not usually what we are doing in reclaiming when we are casting a circle. For us, it's more of a container for that energy. The first practice given in this chapter is a saltwater purification, which I have come across similar practices from different paths, different traditions, different teachers over the years. So this might be a practice that seems kind of similar, or you might have seen this exact thing before, because a lot of people have been using this book for decades too. So you might have seen this exact exercise before. Basically, it involves using salt in water for cleansing or purifying our energy. Some people also do this with just water. Some people do this, many other types of ways. But that is an exercise given here as a method of cleansing the self before doing a ritual. And again, I'm not going to go through every single thing that's in the chapters here, so just so you know, I am kind of jumping specifically to the things that I want to point out that might be like a food for thought, could be a journal prompt or a discussion question that we discussed in the group, or that I came up with on my own for my personal notes. So the next thing I want to mention is, when talking about the quartered circle and the direction of doing different things, there's a lot of books talk about clockwise versus counterclockwise. And something that I just always like to point out that hasn't been mentioned in all of these books, because many of these books were published in the Northern Hemisphere. I have actually done a separate video about this on my channel, talking about some of the differences between hemispheres. And of course, there are many witches and other pagan practitioners in the Southern Hemisphere who I'm sure point this out far more often than the books that were published in the Northern Hemisphere, and things tend to kind of be Northern Hemisphere centric. So the thing to point out here is that Jessel, which is one of the words that you commonly see used, it's spelled D-E-O-S-I-L usually, but there are multiple spellings. It means sunwise, or in the direction of the sun as we see it from Earth. And so most people, when they say sunwise, they're talking about in the Northern Hemisphere, and that happens to go with clockwise. However, south of the equator, that is reversed. Sunwise is actually counterclockwise in the Southern Hemisphere. So I try to update my language when I talk about things from these books. If it's saying clockwise, what they really mean is sunwise, and that is not clockwise in the Southern Hemisphere. So I try to say sunwise instead. The word that we often hear associated with a counterclockwise movement in the Northern Hemisphere is widdershins, and that comes from Germanic. I don't really know what the translation is or like what the meaning is that kind of made that be the word, but I think we all come across it and we just know it as like the opposite of Jessel or counterclockwise. But I also read in another source that this could be thought of as earthwise, because the direction that the earth rotates is one direction, which is why the direction of the sun appears opposite to it. So when we talk about going in a sunwise motion, the earth is moving in the opposite direction. So we could think of the opposite direction as earthwise. And that would also be an equivalent term that would allow for people on either side of the equator to know that it means follow that direction as it is for you in that hemisphere. Whereas saying clockwise, the direction of the clock is the same everywhere on Earth, but that would actually be backwards for some people depending on where they live. The moon phases are also opposite on the other side of the equator. The way that waxing and waning looks appears opposite than it does in the Northern Hemisphere. So again, I have a separate video on my channel about that, but that's a big thing that I like to point out, because a lot of these earlier books and beginner books, many books still even being published now, 2018, 19, 2020, still just say clockwise, but they were published in the Northern Hemisphere. Starhawk also talks about center being the fifth direction in a circle. So if we have the four directions, the four elements, which might be associated with different directions depending on the tradition, that reclaiming also includes center. So there are sort of 7 directions overall, because there would be north, south, east, west, above, below, and center, which often is also interpreted as the witch themselves. So there's lots of associations given here for the different directions, the tools that might be associated with those directions, or with the elements that are associated with the directions. And again, that will depend on the tradition. But in this book, we're talking about east being associated with air, south with fire, west with water, and the north with earth, and then center with spirit or mystery. In talking about tools, Starhawk mentions that there are sort of 2 schools of thought, and this is on page 87 of the 20th anniversary edition. There's the ceremonial magic sort of school. Sorry, I'm putting shadows on my face. I'm using different lighting. So there's the ceremonial magic school, for lack of better terms. This is just how I wrote them in my notes. The ceremonial sort of thought is that tools should only be used for ritual, and they should never be handled by anyone else. And then sort of the opposite end of that is what we might call the kitchen magic school, where your tools can be everyday household items that you continue to use for everyday tasks in addition to ritual. And that when we use those sacred tools for everyday tasks, it makes those everyday tasks take on an element of being sacred. I didn't write it down here because it's not in this text, I don't think, or maybe it is, but I just didn't write it down. But Cara Anderson, also from Anderson fairy tradition, Cara is known to have said, in regards to using a ritually consecrated knife to do an everyday task like chopping up vegetables, I'm not deconsecrating the knife, I'm consecrating the vegetables. So that's one thing we discussed, and that can be some food for thought for you as well, or a journal prompt. What do you think about those 2 different schools of thought, and what are your feelings about how you use your tools? For me, it's a little bit of both. It kind of depends on the tool. There are some things that I don't mind being used for other things, and there are certain tools of mine that I don't like anyone else to touch, and I don't like them being used for anything other than magic or ritual. The next big thing that starts to be talked about in chapter 4 are pentacle meditation tools, and these are some of the things that come from the Anderson fairy tradition into reclaiming. So a couple of the pentacles that are talked about in this chapter are the 5 stages of life, which I later found out from different fairy and reclaiming resources, many people refer to as the pentacle of life. That's not what it's called here in this chapter, but that is a name I found out for it later. But that is the pentacle where the 5 points represent birth, initiation, love or consummation. It has different names when discussed at different times in the book. Repose and death. And again, there are multiple ways that I've seen those 5 things, and this is one of the things that we discussed the most in our discussion group, because it's meant to represent sort of 5 points in the cycle of life. But of course, they don't always happen in the same order for everyone, and they don't all make sense for everyone. And Starhawk touches on that a little bit later in the chapter as well, but we also just discussed this kind of in depth. What are our thoughts on this pentacle and any attempt at sort of coming up with life stages to represent people, knowing that it can be different for everybody. The other pentacles that are mentioned here are the iron and the pearl, and these are 2 major fairy tradition tools. They are also considered some of the core classes of reclaiming tradition now. So the iron one, the 5 points, are sex, pride, self, power, and passion. And of course, pretty much every time Starhawk writes about power, there's a discussion about what kind of power that means. And we talk about it being power from within, or power with, collective and shared power that we have with community members, rather than the sort of dominant idea of power over as like domination or control that many of us think of because of our society and our culture. And then the pearl pentacle has been taught different ways by different people over the years. And so the 5 points that are mentioned in the original text of this book are love, law, wisdom, power, and knowledge. And so when I first read this book, I was thinking about, power is the same point in both of those pentacles, but how is it different when one of them is the iron pentacle and one of them is the pearl, and the other points that are surrounding that? So I came up with my own kind of philosophy about how power is different in those 2. And then later I learned that over the years in reclaiming, some people have actually switched that point in the pearl pentacle, so it becomes liberty. So then the points would be love, law, wisdom, liberty, knowledge. And what's more, one more change that you might see, some people teach it with wisdom and knowledge flipped. So you might see it as love, law, knowledge, liberty, wisdom. So there are changes there. And this chapter briefly goes over how to use those meditative tools for meditation or for achieving a balance of our energies, just very briefly. These are things that have fuller classes and workshops that you can take within Reclaiming Tradition, and I'm sure within Fairy there's more extensive training as well. There are also books now about the Iron Pentacle, and I'm sure at some point we will get one about Pearl. There is a Beauty Pentacle book that was written by Phoenix LaFay, who is a reclaiming teacher, as well as a member of other traditions. And there are many, many other pentacles that have been created for various purposes, but these are some of the main ones that you kind of get an introduction to right here in Spiral Dance Chapter 4. Then Starhawk also gives a circle visualization exercise, and I want to point out that she talks about the fact that this visualization exercise can be done seated, lying down, or while getting up and moving around, facing the different directions physically, or simply turning your attention or focus to those different directions mentally without having to physically move. And I like that that is in here, because I think that that is a really important thing for accessibility and just for establishing that there are really many ways to accomplish the same goal. She also gives a very simple exercise for consecrating your magical tools with the elements, so that's something that's in here. And she talks about how the outer forms of how you actually cast a circle are not quite as important as the strength of, the word she uses is the inner visualization. I think an equally useful term would just be energy. It's more about the strength of the energy that goes into creating that circle. So again, with visualization really including all the senses, it could be the strength of how you imagine your circle feels, how firm its boundaries are, or how flexible and maybe rubbery, bouncy, things that you can see, things that you can hear, taste, touch, smell, any of that, that's all visualization. But I feel like that word does trip people up. So what she's talking about here, she says, in casting a circle, the outer forms used are less important than the strength of the inner visualization. or I would say the strength of the energy being put into it. Because really what I think this quote is saying, which that's on page 96 of this edition, is that the way you cast the circle is not as important as the strength with which you do it. So you don't have to follow the exact circle casting formula that is given in this book or any other book. You can use one of the many, many methods out there that helps you feel like you've created that energetic space the most strongly. So I love that that is in there, again, with that little bit of clarity that I think helps for us today, knowing now the way that a lot of people view the word visualization and how that can sometimes be a barrier. I have videos about visualization as well, and we've talked about it on the pagan perspective too, which is why in the past year it has become so known to me how this word can be kind of a barrier for people, and I want to try to help explain that more and help people get past that. The outer forms can be very simple is another quote from page 96, and that is something also that Cara Anderson of Anderson Fairy Tradition has been known to say, is that repeatedly saying that fairy tradition is really simple. Things do not have to be super complex and complicated and involved. So that's something that also Starhawk is bringing in here. The way that you cast a circle can be extremely simple as long as it's strong and accomplishes that goal for you. She also talks about casting a protective circle, such as shielding just around yourself. And she also talks about permanent protective circles, such as one that you might cast around your entire home or property. I feel like that's something that not a lot of people talk about because we mostly hear about the dangers of leaving a circle up and just leaving the space and never properly taking it down. But I like that it's mentioned here because these are sort of different types of circles, right? There's a circle that we're casting just for our ritual, and that should be taken down because its intention is just to contain the energy of that ritual. And if we leave it there, it will eventually deteriorate, and that energy that's still in there maybe can have some weird effects on our life. But there are other circles that we cast that should remain more permanent, that might be, as this example, around your property. And that might be something that you keep up and you periodically strengthen and refresh. That might be part of your daily practice or weekly practice, or something that you do monthly on the full moon or the dark moon, or whatever makes sense for you. It might be something that once a month you take that circle down and then put it back up for the next month. Again, whatever works for you, but this is just something that, like, the concept of having some circles that stay up for a longer period of time is not often talked about, because we're mostly only hearing people talk about circles that we cast for a specific magical working or for a specific ritual, and that's not the only reason that we might cast a circle. So my first sort of experience with that is when I went to my first witch camp, which is a week-long intensive in reclaiming tradition. That was in 2015. I went to my first one, and the first thing that we all did was cast a circle around the entire camp that stayed there for the duration of the week. And that's also the last thing that we did before we went home. In the course of that week, we had many other circles that were cast for individual rituals, classes, or workings that we were doing. So those were always a circle within the larger circle that was surrounding the entire camp. So that's kind of my first experience with, like, having a circle that's kept up and that you continue feeding energy into it and keeping it up over a period of time. The 10th anniversary notes for chapter 4 talk about other examples of informal versions of circle casting. So Starhawk notes that there is a short form version of circle casting that was taught by Victor Anderson, which goes a little something like, by the earth that is her body, by the air that is her breath, by the fire of her bright spirit, and by the waters of her living womb, the circle is cast. That is what is mentioned in the 10th anniversary notes. However, all these years later, I have heard many different versions of this in community, and the most common one that I hear being used by other people in the tradition is non-gendered and also removes the mention of the womb, so that we're really not focusing on any type of biological specificity. So we use the word our most often. And then the circle casting becomes, by the earth that is our body, by the air that is our breath, by the fire of our bright spirit, and by the water that is our blood, the circle is cast. It actually continues from there, but another version that I heard earlier this year in an online Zoom reclaiming meeting, because we cast circle and have meetings and everything in sacred space as well, I heard a version that was given by someone that actually switched and used different pronouns in every line, and then also included the collective our. So that one was something like, by the earth that is her body, by the air that is his breath, by the fire of their bright spirit, by the water that is our blood. So switching her, his, their, and then our. And you could sub in any pronoun that makes sense for you too. So I really like that. I like that there are always different versions. We're always updating those things as our concepts about gender identity and trying to be more inclusive change over time. The 20th anniversary notes for Chapter 4 include ideas for things that kids can do in ritual, including sprinkling water on everyone for the cleansing or asperging, or banging pots and pans and things like that to cleanse the space with sound, ringing bells, stuff like that. Fun stuff for kids to do. The notes also include other options that can be used instead of more traditional ritual blades or knives, which I personally appreciate because I've never been a fan of blades just in general, so I don't tend to use a ritual knife. But I like the discussion of, like, what is the symbolism that you're trying to have with that tool, and therefore what other kinds of objects can we use for that same symbolism and for the same purpose that it actually holds within our ritual. So our discussion, again, mainly focused on why we cast a circle, how we choose to do it if we choose to do it, our philosophy on the tools, that sort of ceremonial magic versus kitchen magic school. We had a lot of discussion about the pentacle of the 5 life stages, or as I later found out, some people call it the pentacle of life, and the different labels that are given to the different points, the different terms that we might use for different points of life. And then we talked a bit about pentacle work in general, which I was only ever introduced to through Anderson Ferry, which is where Reclaiming got it, and reclaiming. I've never really heard many other people talk about this or utilize this, although they are tools that anyone could incorporate, but they are sort of core elements of fairy and reclaiming as traditions. And pentacle work is one of my absolute favorite things that I have discovered through reclaiming, and I love it. That was a lot for Chapter 4. Thanks for sticking with me there. The next 2 chapters we read together in the month of August. They are Chapter 5, The Goddess, and Chapter 6, The God. So these chapters are actually a little bit shorter. The God chapter is definitely a bit shorter than the Goddess chapter because a lot of the general concept is kind of talked about in Chapter 5, so that by the time you get to Chapter 6, she's just talking about the more specific God things. So the charge of the goddess, which includes a portion that is also known as the charge of the star goddess, was written by Doreen Valiente, and there is an adaptation of it by Starhawk, which might be a version that some people are more familiar with, depending on what version you've seen. But it is an adaptation by Starhawk from something that was written by Valiente, and it plays a large role in this chapter. But one of the first things that I wrote down is a quote, and it is about the idea of immanent divinity, that when people have asked Starhawk if she believes in the goddess, she has answered with something kind of like, "Do you believe in rocks?" So the quote from page 103 is, "In the craft, we do not believe in the goddess. We connect with her through the moon, the stars, the ocean, the earth, through trees, animals, through other human beings, through ourselves. She is here. She is within us all." So my question based off that is, what do you think of this description of immanence and belief? That divinity is as real, as present, as available to connect with as a rock. Starhawk's writing is definitely the first place that I was introduced to the concept and the term immanent divinity or immanence, although Starhawk's writing is far from the only place that you will hear these terms. Just happened to be my personal introduction to it, and I feel like that might be the case for others as well. And there's definitely, of course, I think, as you can probably expect, in the original text of this book, in these 2 chapters, the goddess and the god, there's a lot of very gendered stuff, there's a lot of binary, there's a lot of discussion of physical bodies and biological differences and how that applied to this tradition, which really did come out of the feminist movement in the 60s and in the 70s. And then, as I mentioned, there are updates in the 10th and 20th anniversary notes from the late 80s and the late 90s. Many of those notes are Starhawk mentioning how concepts of gender roles, gender binary, gender identity, etc. have changed over the decades, have evolved. So the original text is still in place as it was published in the 70s, as it was written in the 70s. Starhawk was in her 20s when this was first written and published. And then there are updates from her in her 30s and in her 40s as she was changing, and also as the community was changing, and obviously the surrounding circumstances in life were changing. And so again, now we are 20 years beyond this, and many of us have different concepts about these things. These were a lot of the things that we discussed in the group with my Patreon community. A lot of us are very interested in how do we update that language, as many of us are looking to move further away from that binary languaging. So just bear in mind, there's a lot of that in these chapters. So one of my questions here is, Starhawk talks about the goddess being associated with the feminine aspect of a binary. She also emphasizes in this book at this time the connection to women's bodies and their importance and sacredness, that they are not unclean as some other religious traditions had taught over the centuries. So some of my questions here are for us to think about, how have cis female bodies been treated historically in our culture and in our society? How are they treated today? Is this still a relevant topic for those of us who increasingly look to move beyond binary concepts? The next things in this chapter are talking about the waxing full and waning moon, and different meditations for those stages, and how those stages of the moon are associated with different ages of people's lives. And here in this chapter, we're specifically referring to stages of women's lives. However, we can think of it as ages of people's lives, right? Young, middle-aged, and elderly, essentially. And we can break that up even further, but some of the most common that we hear is the waxing moon associated with childhood, the full moon associated with adulthood, and the waning moon associated with elderhood or sagehood. So Starhawk talks about how women are valued, both young and old, and different values are often assigned to those different ages, such as young being associated with beauty and vitality, and old age being associated with wisdom. But she points out here that in witchcraft, generally, all of those things are valuable and equally honored and respected, and also apply across all ages. So discussion point that I wrote down to go with this is ageism. Ageism in the witchcraft community. How does this manifest in our community? How does it manifest in society overall? How does the way that it plays out in our community, in our movement, how is it directly connected to how it is in society? Are there times that we are countering the way that we feel it is in the rest of society? Ageism. Thoughts. On page 105, Starhawk mentions that the parts of the Pentacle of Life, as I mentioned before, that she talks about as being birth, initiation, love or consummation, or here sometimes it's also referred to as ripening, and then repose or reflection, and death. There are many, many different terms that people have used for these. She points out that not all of the world's societies or cultures have placed value on initiation as a stage equally for all people until more recently, because boys in many cultures often had these periods of self-discovery and celebrations of growing up and becoming a man from being a boy. But the main thing for girls coming of age was the onset of menarche, having their menstrual cycle, and really in some cultures and societies that just meant, okay, now you can bear children and now you can be married off. So it was kind of going from being under the purview of their father to being under the purview of a husband, which is very different than sort of the coming age process of a boy now being a man. And so she talks about how today we might think of that stage of initiation for females, again in some cultures and societies, as including things like establishing their career, creative pursuits, exploring relationships, and something that I wrote down was also further education could be thought of as a time of initiation and kind of another step that we might do in between some of these other things. And Starhawk notes that some women who miss this earlier stage of development of getting to explore, start a career, engage creatively, whatever, people who miss that often go back to it later in life when they sort of have the time and realize, I never got to do this thing. So the stages of this pentacle of life can happen out of order for different people. And then my question would also be, if we're thinking about all of these things as relevant to our culture and our society, or certain cultures and certain societies, then what about other cultures and other societies? Are there cultures around the world throughout history or now that do things differently? And what does that tell us about how we interact with the overculture that we happen to find ourselves in? On page 106, there is a quote, "The nature of the goddess is never single. Wherever she appears, she embodies both poles of duality, life in death, death in life." And so to me, I wrote, to me, the above quote says that it was never about the gods, which I spell Godds for all or any gendered deities, plural. It was never about the gods being only one thing, one extreme or one side of a binary. The goddess, for example, is all things, whole unto herself. So for me, something as simple as that one little quote is a little hint that, even though we think of these things in binary terms because that's languaging that some people understand, and especially that used to be more common, that it was never really about them having to be only one thing. These deities were also always thought of as being everything. Starhawk also says, "The goddess is both psychological symbol and manifest reality. She exists and we create her." So that's a very interesting one that I wrote down. And then on page 107, Starhawk says, "We know the goddess is not a woman, but we respond with love as if she were, and so connect emotionally with all the abstract qualities behind the symbol." So my thought about that, what I wrote down in my personal notebook is, to me, the above quote suggests that any way we connect to this energy, any way that works for us, is valid. She, referring to the goddess as a symbol, could just as easily be non-binary, use they, them, or other pronouns, could just as easily be a trans woman, or a non-human animal. Who do we respond to with love? So again, what Starhawk had written was, we know the goddess is not a woman. We respond in love as if she were. Who do you respond to in love? Who or what, as a symbol, would be that for you? There is a double spiral exercise. The only thing I want to point out there is that I originally envisioned it as being this sort of spiral here, and then it goes out and spirals back the other way, double spiral. But when you actually read the exercise, it becomes clear that she's actually talking about the kind of spiral that goes in, and then when it reaches the center, spirals back out, following the same path backward. So I just wanted to point that out for anyone else for whom it might be confusing. If you're reading the book, there is no image associated with it, so I drew it here in my own notes for myself, that it's like that. Spiral going in, spiral coming back out. The next few pages of the chapter, page 108 to 111 in this edition, are basically a line-by-line explanation or analysis of the charge of the goddess. So she talks about everything mentioned in the charge of the goddess, everything from the way that deity is seen to the full moon symbolism, quotes from Robert Graves and how that influenced it, the idea of nakedness, nudity, practicing naked, and so on, essentially going line by line through the charge. So some discussion questions from me. What is the nature of deity in your view? Separate beings, all the same, both, neither, symbols, archetypes. One of my favorite quotes, kind of ever, but Definitely one of my favorite quotes from Starhawk is on page 109, and it is, "A witch's loyalty is to the truth before any ideology or any comforting illusions." It is brought up here in this chapter in reference to the idea of nakedness as part of spiritual practice. Nakedness, vulnerability, truth, illusion. What are your thoughts on these things? Elsewhere in the chapter, Starhawk also says, the law of the goddess is love, and that love includes animals, plants, the earth itself, all beings. So my question for that is, if that is true, if we agree with that and if we believe that, how do we act on that charge? In this chapter, Starhawk mentions that most witches believe in some form of reincarnation, part of a worldview of cyclical processes, a wheel with no end. What are your thoughts on this? Reincarnation? I know this is one of the things that most people have very different views about. Again, in this chapter, she talks a bit about sacrifice and offering, which I talked about a little bit more in my video about chapters 1 through 3, because that came up in our discussions there as well. So continuing that, she talks about how goddess spirituality, goddess religion is really about self-celebration, not self-abnegation. And so how does that play into sacrifice and offering, and your thoughts on that? And then also, my last discussion topic for this chapter is the original text says what the goddess can represent for a woman and what the goddess represents for a man. But the notes from the 10th and 20th anniversary editions reveal changing views on binary gender over time. And now, in 2020, many more of us embrace a move away from the binary. So, how could we speak about these concepts now? Not what does the goddess mean for a woman, for a man, but what does this symbol or things that have been associated with this symbol, the idea of a goddess and a god, deity in general, divinity in general, how can we speak about those things in ways that are universal to all of us? You know, what do these symbols do for us? Period. What do these symbols do for a trans person, or a non-binary person, or a genderqueer or gender fluid person? How can we think about those concepts differently now? And the chapter ends with examples of chants and invocations, and I just wanted to note that many of them, though not all that are mentioned in the book, can be found on a playlist. There are recordings of reclaiming chants, there have been a few albums, and there is a big master playlist that is available on Spotify or on YouTube. So I will link you to the YouTube playlist. I listen to it a lot myself. It has been cool to learn some of the chants that I've seen like typed out. I've seen the lyrics, but I didn't know how they go. So those are on the playlist. And then there's many more on there that are not mentioned in this book. There are many that are being written all the time for individual classes, camps, whatever. The chants, the music, the singing is probably one of my favorite aspects of this tradition as well. And there are probably a lot of songs that you'll notice in the playlist that you may have heard in pagan community that you didn't know were from these people, like you never knew who wrote them. That was definitely the case for me. There are songs here that I learned from other people and I had no idea what tradition they actually came from or who wrote them. Citation is a feminist practice. I really appreciate that the source of these things is noted. A lot of the time, George Franklin has added a little description or a comment on some of the videos on YouTube telling us more about how that song came to be or who created it or what class it was created for. We don't have that information right there about everything, but I always love when I see that someone has left a comment with some of that background information. And lastly for this video, chapter 6 is about the god. It opens with invocations and poetry, and then right away says on page 120, the image of the horned god in witchcraft is radically different from any other image of masculinity in our culture. So my first question is, what is the overall image of masculinity in our culture? How does the horned god compare and contrast to it? And to that of other cultures whose images we may also be aware of. Again, anytime Starhawk kind of says, in our culture, in our society, I definitely resonate with that, because I do the same thing where I try to be very specific that I'm talking about how it applies here, because we're aware that that's not how it works elsewhere. But my question for kind of like furthering this for myself, so maybe this is for those of you who kind of already have an idea of how you feel about it in our culture, my next question, ponderance for furthering that, is, well, what about other cultures? Can we research what it's like in other cultures? The image of masculinity or manliness in other cultures can be very different than how it is for many of us in the Western world. Another question is, how do you view the role of the god in your path or practice? Do you recognize him or not? Do you recognize gendered forms at all? This chapter talks briefly about separatist witchcraft, which is something that we discussed quite a bit and looked at in the discussion group. Somebody shared like the Wikipedia article about what it means. We talked a bit about what that means as a political term, because when I was reading it just in the context of the book, I wasn't familiar with this term. I had forgotten that it was mentioned in this book before, so it was like seeing it again for the first time. And my impression was that it's what we would call trans-exclusionary today. But some of the other people in the discussion group shared a little more information, and again, like the Wikipedia article and stuff, so we looked at some supplementary material about separatism and what like separatist feminism was as like a political movement, and then separatist witchcraft kind of coming out of that. So I learned that it's not exactly the same, and so while today some people who were separatists would be called trans-exclusionary today, they were not actually the same thing, and at the time it wasn't really looking at cisgender versus transgender at all. So I think stuff like that is important, because knowing the context of the history, like knowing what the term meant then, is important, because it might not be the same as what it is today. Again, this chapter talks a bit about gender roles and expectations of society and our culture. So again, my thought is, what about other cultures? If other cultures do things in a different way, does that not allow that we can choose other ways of being, other ways of doing, other ways of speaking about these things? There's also a little bit of psychology in this chapter. It talks about the way that anger is dealt with, feelings of powerlessness, projection. And this chapter also talks about the patriarchy as literally the rule of the fathers, the idea of the father as an archetype for real male individuals in the world, and also for the god. So my question that comes out of this discussion is, what are our views on fathers? How does this archetype affect how we see the horned god or other male deities from any traditions, any cultures? What is the expectation versus reality, to reference a more contemporary meme, of the father archetype? What do we expect of a father versus the reality of fathers as we see them? The horned god also, mythologically speaking, is his own father. So how does that change things? How does that make it different as a symbol or concept or a figure to connect with? This chapter, as well as the goddess chapter a little bit, talks about sexuality and the sacredness of sexuality, sex, and the physical body. And on page 123, Starhawk writes, "In its essence, it is not limited to the physical act. It is an exchange of energy, of subtle nourishment between people. Through connection with another, we connect with all." She also talks about consent, informed consent, permission, and that it is a violation of any body, regardless of biology, to violate it or to use it to violate another. So my question out of this is, what are your views on the sacredness of our sexuality? Not just the physical act of sex, but the nature of sexuality, the spectrum of sexuality, and sensuality as well. In talking about dramatic tragedies and death and rebirth and these kind of ritualized stories of the death and rebirth of the god, Starhawk also mentions reincarnation again, saying that not all witches believe in literal reincarnation, but many do see it as a metaphor for transformation, as we see in the cyclical processes of nature. She talks about how the god in dying becomes the archetype of the hunter who also takes life, and that for hunting cultures, the hunt was life, but it was always done with reverence. It was sacred. It was never wasteful, and it was never done needlessly. And because earlier this year I read a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass, this stuck out to me when rereading this chapter because this sort of philosophy is what Indigenous North Americans or Native Americans and Robin Wall Kimmerer, specifically in this book, refers to as the honorable harvest. So I wrote that down because that's another term that we might hear used for this type of philosophy where it's never wasteful, it's never done needlessly, and it is considered sacred, always done with like ritual significance. And it's a very mindful and intentional thing, and there is sacredness throughout the process. Starhawk describes in this chapter that there are many men involved in witchcraft, but it still remains thought of as being made up of women. She talks about how it offers women a model of inner strength and power that isn't offered by other world religions, and of men, it tends to ask that they give up some traditional forms of power that are afforded to them by other religious traditions. So to me, this becomes a discussion of privilege as we would talk about it today, and the different benefits that different types of cultures and societies give to different people based on who they are. Starhawk says men are not inferior in witchcraft, but neither are they automatically superior to women as other cultures and systems sort of inherently have built in. So the idea, of course, is equality, but as you may have seen in like memes and things going around on the internet today, I've definitely seen this a lot, the idea that if you've always been granted a position of power automatically, you've always been given more privilege, more power, more control, more say in a situation by default, then when you enter into a situation where you are given equal power and authority with other groups of people, that can feel like you have less because you're not used to being equal, you're used to being above. So some people think of this as wanting to switch it so that women are superior, and what Starhawk is saying here is that that's not the idea. The idea is that men are not inferior, but neither are they automatically superior, and to some people that can make them feel inferior because they're not used to true equality, and that is what we strive for. Again, she talks about consent and women's bodies and man's bodies and bodies in general, and the way that different structures of power make different people feel like they have power and authority and say over other people's bodies, and that witchcraft and striving for equality challenge those ways that some people might be used to and ask us to interact with our own and other people's bodies in a different way. One quote from this chapter that I like, that I have actually posted on Instagram before years ago, is on page 127, and it is, "In witchcraft, there are no comforting, all-knowing father figures who promise answers for everything at the price of one's personal autonomy. The craft calls on each of us to be our own authority, and that can be an uncomfortable position." In the new Reclaiming Witchcraft Pagan Portals book that was written by Irisanya Moon, Irisanya also talks about being our own personal authority in witchcraft, but the quote is actually a little bit more than that, and so you'll hear this a lot in Reclaiming Community today. So I like that Irisanya brings this up in the new book, and it is, "Each of us is our own personal authority in community." That definitely adds another layer of consideration to it, right? That it adds that sort of power with the shared power that we have with other people in community, because yeah, we are our own spiritual authority and we can do whatever we want, but we are also members of a community. We also affect other people and are affected by other people. And so we make our own choices, but we also take into account other people. We are our own personal authority in community. So wrapping up my notes here, the last little bit for chapter 6, the previous few notes outline essentially what are offered as reasons that some men might not immediately be attracted to paths like witchcraft, because it seems like they're asked to give up a lot of comfort, power, and privilege that might be afforded to them by other religious and spiritual paths. And I wrote, this is true for all of us in many ways, not gender or sex specific. But then there's also a bit where Starhawk talks about what men, and again, any of us, any and all of us really, have to gain from paths like this. Moving away from constraints of our patriarchal system is liberating for everyone, is what I wrote down. That there would be, so some of the potential gains are no split between mind, body, and spirit, real connections based on every individual's full, true, and honest self, the chance to be our own authority in community, and having the support of community, no limiting societal expectations, and fun and playfulness not being forbidden to us as adults. So my main question out of this discussion of like why some people, and again, I don't think this is gendered, I think this is some people are not attracted to paths like witchcraft because it asks us to live differently. It asks us to tackle hard questions and change things about the way that we've been living our lives, and to question the structures of oppression around us. And not everyone is willing to do that. And other people are willing to do that and excited to do that, but still not 100% sure. And we might mess up along the way. And sometimes that can discourage people from doing it. And other times we have to realize that's just part of the journey. That's part of the growth process, right? It's growing pains. So out of this discussion of what some people, focus on as what we have to lose, what witchcraft asks us to give up, and also what we gain from it, my question is, for you personally, think about what witchcraft asks you to give up, and what does witchcraft offer you that you can gain. And you can think of this as for any type of pagan path as well. If you don't consider yourself a witch, what does this path, as compared to other spiritualities or religions, what is it asking you to give up? How is it challenging you? And how can you grow from that? So it's a little bit pros and cons, but it's also just like inherently asking us to reframe this idea of, oh, I'm having to give things up, I'm losing things. It's asking us to reframe that as, what are we being asked to shed off that really isn't serving the world that we want to live in? How are we being asked to start with ourselves and change ourselves first? And what do we know that we could gain if we go through that transformative process? So thank you so much for sticking with me through this. I know these videos are long because I'm going through a lot of chapters here. I've thought about breaking them up even further, but I just feel like I don't really want to have a 13 video long series. So there is a timestamp table of contents in the description of the video as well. So hopefully people can click through and just watch a little bit at a time. So yeah, those are some of my notes and some of the things that we discussed about Spiral Dance chapters 4 through 6. Next video in a couple of months, we'll be talking about chapters 7 through 9, and then the last one, early next calendar year, we'll be going over chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13, and wrapping up. Thank you very much for watching and or listening. I will see you next time, and until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.